David, we'll start out. My wife, Charlotte, always jokes that she was a much better parent before she had any children. I know you and Karen don't have any kids of your own. So what makes you an expert in engaging adult kids?
Well, I love starting out with such a friendly question. No, but you're absolutely right. Full disclosure. So my wife, Karen, and I, we've been married 40 years. We don't have children, but we are the doting aunt and uncle of 5 nieces and 5 godchildren, 5 godsons as it happens. So we've been very invested in their lives at some of the high points, the low points, the terrible teens, and their young adulthood. So that's one set of experiences. And the other is through teaching, the pleasure and the gift of teaching. I taught at Yale for 5 years. In the past 12, 13 years, I've been teaching at Princeton. And to be with such amazing students who are what give me hope for the future, maybe they've taught me a thing or two over the years. I'm certainly not an expert, but what I have really thought a lot about is how do you engage, whether it's in the classroom or over a cup of coffee when their students are visiting us in our house or in general. And one conclusion I have had is that they really want to have conversations about big topics, serious things, and not just talk about the weather. So in that regard, maybe there's a thing or two I could perhaps share as we go along.
And you actually polled a big number of your former students before you gave this this talk the first time, right?
Yeah, so I want to give also a shout out. There's a group called Halftime that asked me to give this talk of a similar nature to them. And one of the things I tell my students, I have this list of aphorisms. It's a business ethics class I teach, but I look at this how to succeed without selling your soul. I look at the class through the lens of different religious traditions and to see are there sort of different kind of resources there that might help people think about this topic. And I often sort of leave these aphorisms. One is never go swimming in the deep end by yourself. If you don't know the answer and you're in a tough ethical dilemma, talk to someone you respect, ask someone. So I figured I didn't know how to be an expert on the topic. So I asked my students, and I've kept in touch. I've got an email list of about 80 students, former students. They range in age from 20 to 36 years old. And I sent a note out saying, hey, what would you say, or what should I say to this group of alumni and folks who care deeply about the Princeton and the generation to come and the generations. So from that, I got, get this as a hit ratio, I got about 40 responses from people, some deeply personal, very interesting of things that they shared. And I'll draw on some of their inputs that they gave me as we go forward. So it was an amazing sort of data set of really capable, deeply interested young men and women. And I might add, they represented over 20 different majors at Princeton, 20 different concentrations, about an even male-female split of 50-50, a wide verse of race, ethnicity, international students as well. Just a handful are married, but nonetheless, there's that population as well is included. And of also different faith traditions, primarily being represented by Catholicism, Protestantism, and Judaism. But there are also several on this list who would self-describe as spiritual but not religious, or they would self-describe as being atheist or agnostic. So it's a wonderful mix of just great insights. And I think a lot about this question of faith, so that will weave in and out maybe of some of our conversation.
I think it's a nice comment on your relationship with your students that they respond to that kind of an email. So you've given this talk before. What's the biggest fear that you hear from parents about trying to engage their adult kids?
Yeah, and just for slight clarification, so it's not really a talk, just like we're doing, it's a conversation. So this is our conversation. It'll go where you lead us, Pat, and as people begin chatting in on their little chat or Q&A part where we go. But what have I found? Some from my own experience as I talk to different parents, like Pat, you and I, and Charlotte talk about your kids or other folks I know. And so some is just listening to my peers, and others is things that these students told me. Well, I think one of the biggest things that parents will say as a fear is, I'm not a subject matter expert. Like, how do I go into this? I don't even know how to bring up the conversation. So maybe they want to talk with their child about relationships, like who their child might be dating or seeing, or maybe they want to talk about how their child is spending their time, or social media, or money, or religion, or any number of things. But one of the biggest fears is like, how do I even start the conversation? And and I'm sure it's not the case of many folks in this call, but let's face it, a lot of us as parents or aunts and uncles, we might have a strained relationship with our child, or it might be there might be some difficulties that have come up over the years. And so how do you get past some old narratives that prevent you from trying afresh?
So it's not like this is the first time you've talked with your kids about deep subjects, but maybe there's not been the same intensity or same crisis atmosphere that brings families together to talk about them the way they are now.
Yeah, I think that's true. And one of the things which sort of spurred this whole topic, as opposed to a general thing of how do we talk to our adult children about deep questions of life, is the pandemic. Many children, their whole world changed back in March. And suddenly their companies either furloughed them, fired them, or even if they kept them on the payroll, they said, you're working at home now. And well, if they didn't have an apartment or couldn't afford to keep one, they moved back in with mom and dad or whatever the scenario might be. And it might be a blended family. It may not be the mother of their childhood or the father of their childhood. So it's just all different. And suddenly you have a mature, competent, let's say, Wall Street analyst who's 28 years old and shooting the lights out and full of vim and vigor. And they're back in their childhood room with, posters of Michael Jordan on their wall. and like the whole, you as family systems psychologists will tell us that we almost go back and role play where we were 15 years ago, 5 years ago. Well, how do we break out of that? And let's face it, even really healthy, wonderful families, it's hard to talk about some topics. But again, it's both the how you even get into it, and then how do you carry on the conversation once the door has been opened.
Well, those old days were much more dogmatic discussions that I had with my kids. I assume that doesn't work now that they're adults. I know it doesn't work. What works better than telling them the way it is?
Yeah. Well, one way of framing it is, if you think about it, when your children are younger, and there's Lawrence Kohlberg, now deceased, but a great psychologist and cognitive behavioral psychologist from Harvard, talk about different stages of life and different stages of development. And broadly speaking, there are 4 different stages. But for purposes of this conversation, when your children are younger, when they're on your payroll, so to speak, before they go off to college and then start their own careers, you're kind of the authority figure, particularly when they're younger. You know right from wrong, good for bad, what's going to hurt you, what's not going to hurt you. And most parents do a pretty active job of telling their children that, yes and no. But over time, they change, they individuate, and they need to start figuring out what good and bad looks like, what pretty and ugly looks like, what fair and unfair looks like. So there's a change of roles. And I think particularly when the children are out, or as adult children, maybe for a year or so during the pandemic back home, we're no longer authority figures, but we're guides. We're trail guides, helping someone on the journey. Part of that means really shifting our ratio of listening versus speaking and finding out, well, where do you want to go on your journey? They may not know, but I think they'll be really glad being asked the question. In fact, maybe one way, like if there's some of us on this call or just in general yearning to have just getting these deep questions of life, but you have no idea how to hit the tee, hit the ball off the first tee, is maybe actually just share the invitation that Pat sent out and say to you, let's say your daughter's name is Sally. Say, Sally, I just sat in this webinar and it got me thinking, I'm 50X now or 60X, and I'd love to share a couple things about my life that might be of help to you. But frankly, I want to hear what's on your mind. And, maybe I haven't done a good job over the years raising difficult topics, but I'd like to practice and learn if you're willing to teach me and help me do that. So you end up having a conversation as opposed to a lecture, inviting them maybe to tee it off. Like, gosh, are there any couple of things in your mind that maybe have always been there, but maybe particularly during the pandemic? And I wouldn't be surprised if they'll come up with something. They'll give you the first entree.
Well, the pandemic is certainly is probably the biggest crisis that our adult kids have faced in their lives. And there's obviously a lot of uncertainty and fear associated with this. How do we help them now to deal with this uncertainty and fear?
Maybe one of the best things, it's a lesson I've learned slowly through teaching, and to the extent there's some analog between teaching and parenting, and that's you don't have to have all the answers. In fact, acknowledging that you don't have all the answers is often a really way to build some trust. Because by now, all of our children, our nieces, nephews, whatever, they've all figured out that as parents, we don't have it all figured out. They know that we're not perfect. They know we've made some mistakes. Some may be big, visible ones. Other ones, just because they're smart, they've observed them. And there's a sense of humanness that, you know, and I think letting them know that you hope to learn from them too, that you're no longer going to have all the answers, that really frees everybody up. And there might be another method to help get a conversation going if your child asks you a question is to tell a story. Like, don't give them a proposition or don't give them the answer, but say, let's say it's about money, for example. When I asked my students, one of the questions that came up again and again was money. And interestingly, not just their own plans, but questions of, will I ever be able to meet my parents' accomplishments or exceed my parents' accomplishments financially or reputationally or society's stature, so to speak. And it might be helpful as a parent. So we know it's interesting you say that. When I was your age, I was actually pretty terrified about the same thing. I wasn't sure whether I was going to be able to do as good as my father did or my mother did. To maybe even to tell a story where you had that same anxiety or fear or concern that they did. People remember stories. They don't remember 3-point presentations, but they remember stories. And the more we could tell stories where we're not the hero, maybe even we were the GOAT, the kids will, and they know you're not perfect anymore, so you don't have to pretend. It's very free. It'll probably be more therapeutic for all of us than for them, but they'll cherish that. They'll cherish that. It's a sign of respect.
You know, I remember as my parents got older that the thing I had trouble dealing with was that they were no longer as capable of handling their affairs as they were once. You know, I think children, no matter what their age, they look at their parents and see the parents who raised them, not the ones that they've aged into. And I think that financial question becomes something that really is a topic, because the kids in another 10 or 20 years are actually going to be running their parents' finances and financially responsible for them the way the parents were when the kids were little.
You're so right. One of the students, when I sent out this plea for help and got these amazing answers, one of the students, she wrote, obviously I'm not going to mention anyone's name, but she wrote that her father was in finance his whole career. Her mother was first stay at home and then an entrepreneur in her own right. But she said during back in March when the market crashed massively, that her father sold 25% of his stock holdings. And of course took a bath because he sold back when it was around 18 or 19,000 the Dow, and it's of course bounced back up. And it just hit her like, oh my gosh, my dad, who I always viewed as this rock and this great finance guy, he made a rookie mistake. He sold at he didn't have a liquidity problem. It was just fear of losing his capital base. And so that began a conversation in her family, and she's very accomplished. She's a lawyer, she's a judge now. And she said that she and her husband, they've been now married a few years, a few kids, they'd never had a budget. So like, hey mom, dad, did you have a budget? And like, who controlled the budget? Was it on paper? I remember my mom actually had envelopes growing up. She had like the envelope for groceries, the envelope for this bill or that bill. Of course, we're a little more digital now, but and even questions like the number, right? The number. Many people I deal with in the marketplace or my students, when they reach age X, have X number in the bank. When I was younger, $1 million was a target. Now everyone wants 10 million. Whatever what's the number? Well, do you really need that number? And what happens if you hit that number? Do you kind of raise it now a little bit more? And they're really interested in having that. Like, how did you deal with that, mom and dad? And maybe would you change it now? Looking back, what would you do differently? It's sort of this bi-directional conversation. They would be hungry to hear that, even as you'll learn from them. It's not just this top-down; it's back and forth. But a question about money and all of its even boring components, savings, budget, targets. ask them, hey, did you ever get laid off? Did you ever get fired in downsizing? Many of us in this call are old enough to have had grandparents or even my parents who were at the tail end of the Depression, where they still know how to squeeze a nickel. And even if they're financially very well off at this point, what was it like? Does that remind you of what we're going through now?
Well, and of course that segues for a lot of kids. Their carefully laid career plans are in tatters right now, with first jobs disappearing, everyone working from home, not really in touch with their peers or their bosses. How do we make them feel better about what they're going through at this point?
Gosh, I'm just thinking, I hadn't thought of this until you just asked the question that way. If there's one sort of common golden thread which goes to this whole conversation, it's acknowledge when you were their age, more or less, assuming you did, that you had some of these and other questions too. And while you maybe didn't go through the Spanish flu of 1918, you're doing this one now, you have analogs. Certainly things happened. There's been different times with market crashes for a variety of reasons, the Vietnam War, other things that their parents went through it. So I think the golden thread is to share stories when you went through something analogous. And even say, you could even ask them, like, do you have any, like, what are you afraid of right now? Or what, if you really put it out there, what makes you anxious about your career? And they're going to say things like, I just got an email from one of my former students. So he's got an elite job at Goldman Sachs, but he's starting not at his trading desk, he's starting at his home, in his apartment, in his childhood room. He's learning how to trade marketable securities, right? But how do you find a mentor? How do you find a big brother, someone who could take you aside and say, hey man, you really blew that. Here's how you need to handle that next time. Or that's not how you should interact with the MD, or how, and to help ask them, what are the things that you're doing? Because maybe I never dealt with them, but let's think about them together.
The thing I think it's hard for a lot of kids is that they've come up in an environment where they've been looking at their peers and constantly weighing where they're going against where their peers are going. And now all of that ends, or at least it's, they may feel it's not ending, but it's a lot more difficult to know how they're doing. And that's going to continue until they're actually back in a work environment where they're around coworkers and colleagues.
Yeah, because you have that feedback, instant feedback when you're in office, for better or worse. You have feedback, and when, as we know as adults, when you don't have that tactile, visual, informal feedback, it's hard. I think also another general challenge, even without the pandemic, is that, let's take the average Princeton graduate. They're, needless to say, very bright, multi-talented. They have one of the most elite educations in the world. And suddenly they're back out at the bottom of the totem pole after having had years of success that got them more success, that got them into Princeton. And now they're rookies again. And what's that mean? What's that look like? And for some of them, it's a I don't want to say comeuppance, but it's unnerving. The Princeton pedigree will certainly open many doors their whole life, but once the door is open, you have to deliver yourself. So many even have performance anxiety. Can I really do it? A lot of people from the humanities will go into Wall Street or go into investment banking, and they're very anxious because that's not what they studied. And other hires, might be locked and loaded because they know all the terminology. They've passed their Series 7 or whatever. So
we raised our two kids Catholic. They went to Sunday school and received all of the sacraments. I went to Catholic schools before Princeton, but I'm not sure how observant they are, and I have trouble asking them. For parents who are still religiously observant, or even those who may not be practicing but feel a spiritual component to their lives, how do you talk with your kids about this now that you can't get them out of bed and force them to go to church with you every Sunday morning?
Yeah. And of course, and I know you know this because of our private conversations you and I have had, it's the same question whether you're Jewish, Catholic, Protestant, Hindu, Muslim, whatever, that if the tradition that you have either inherited or chosen is one that your children are kind of backing off on or not quite sure, that could be really unsettling and concerning. So I really respect immensely your question. And for what it's worth, so the sidebar, but this class I teach, Business Ethics and Modern Religious Thought, the students I didn't think anyone would ever sign up for the course, because we're looking at ethics through the role of religion. What does Judaism say? What does Christianity say? What does Islam? We look at the three Abrahamic traditions. And the course is sold out. It's crazy. They want to have intelligent, respectful conversations. And as long as they get the sense that you, or in my case as their prop, I'm not trying to sell them a particular worldview. I'm trying to present different ones and their richness. They breathe this deep sigh of relief, and then they can't wait to have a conversation. So it's not one of judgment, it's one of curiosity, it's one of invitation. So maybe back to your question, so how do you get there, particularly if you're anxious, because many people tell me, I'm no expert on, let's say in your case, Catholic. I wouldn't even know how to describe my own faith. I feel a little clumsy. I'm not ordained. I didn't study theology. I just kind of do my thing. And so that you might have a feeling of inadequacy. And that's okay. Again, your children will completely get that, because they're probably feeling the same thing. They'll respect you for saying it. But how do you actually start that initial conversation? Maybe it's not your lead with one, but maybe if you talk to your kids about this general topic, say, look, we're going to have several months together, or looks like, or be seeing each other more on weekends than we used in the past. Let me throw out a crazy idea. I'd love to pick a topic of the week, and let's do one a week. Let's have a 10-week syllabus or a 10-week whatever. You pick 5 and I'll pick 5. And maybe we'll converge, somewhere overlap, maybe not. And frankly, they don't have to be hard and fast. Let's see what you come up with. And if you want to pick all 10, I cede my time to you and topics to you, and you could do that. And then you, however you want to do it, over a meal or over a beer or a coffee, whatever works for you, you then have these setup conversations. And one of them could be the conversation of I call it the question of God, the question of God. In fact, there's a great book you might even want to recommend to your kids called The Question of God by he's in his 90s, a retired professor at Harvard, an MD, and Armand Nikolai. He wrote a book called The Question of God. I recommend it to my students all the time. Sometimes I have parts of it on the syllabus. He took two incredible thinkers of about the same generation, C.S. Lewis, the famous Oxford Don, an extraordinary scholar, and Sigmund Freud, and compared 2 lives of 2 men with strong father figures. One was raised Christian, one was raised Jewish. Both renounced them, both became atheists or agnostic. Later, Lloyd converted, he changed. He came back to his faith of his childhood as a Christian. But it's this extraordinary book, just putting forward the question. And Armand Nikolai, Professor Nikolai, used to say, that's perhaps the most important question in life, the question of God. And if you answer like God exists, yes or no, and whatever you pick is fine, but the answer matters. And then your life will often tilt in different directions. You might make different decisions based on the answer. And I make really clear to my students, and I want to accent on this, I'm not trying to talk someone into being something they're not, but I want to encourage people to have the difficult conversation, which I think is what you're saying. And you will probably get from your children, in fact, they're the same ones I would give. Religion is so hypocritical. There's so many nuts out there, and I can't believe it. And the religion's the cause of all the world's wars. There's a litany of reasons why organized religion is problematic. And I think we have to own that, whether we are religiously inclined or not. But equally, there are some extraordinary things that religion has done for society, for individuals. It's changed lives, it's changed cultures, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But I think put it on your list and say, maybe we need to journey together. Maybe we need to find a book if you feel inadequate in saying, what does it mean to be a modern day Jew? What does it mean to be a modern day Christian or whatever? There's amazing books out there. And if you can't find any, shoot me a note and I'll suggest 1 or 2 that could just be a joint exercise that you read through a book together. Or go to the text of your tradition. And if some of you on the phone are, in fact, I say this to my students, if you are atheist or agnostic, someone in your family tree was something. So your grandma was whatever. She immigrated from Russia, or she's from Germany, or she's from the UK. You probably have some religious identity in your heritage. Pick that as your starting base and learn a bit about it and see what that, if anything, might have to do with your world. what students have told me is, and those who are more inclined towards spiritual questions and thinking about this space in their life, they've found that precisely in this time of everything being so chaotic and so upended and nothing that you could rely on, that their faith serves as nothing else as an anchor, sort of giving them stability, some peace. It also serves for many as a moral foundation or an ethical foundation. Again, I'm not making the argument you have to be religious to be ethical. We know a lot that's not true. But it for many can give them extra moral courage to take on injustices or to take on broken cultures and the like. So I think my guess is your children will be surprised when this topic comes up and is raised. But I think also if you approach it gently and say you're still trying to figure some things out too, my guess is they would be thrilled to have that conversation. And for what it's worth, I'm teaching this class that's sold out, and it's not because of me, it's the topic. The students are really, they want to have interesting, respectful conversations, even if you both end up totally disagreeing. That I know Howard was calling one of his, he talks to me about his nephew. One of his nephews comes from a very faith-oriented family, and one of his nephews is a very active atheist. Well, that's fine, and they have conversations.
I think if any of us asked our children for a list of topics that they'd like to talk about, especially on the day after a presidential debate that was really hard to watch last night, politics is going to be high on the list. And Jack Warner asked, how do you deal with profound disagreement on a topic like the current elections with your kids?
Wow. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I had a really good answer, I'd write a book, Jack. Let me give some top of head thoughts. First, maybe it's this another overarching theme, another sort of thread through all this is that to say to your adult children, I would like to, in our remaining years together, for as long as I'm on Earth, in addition to talking about the Yankees or the opera or whatever it is that brings joy in your life, I'd like to talk about some deep things. And we could take, and one I want to talk about is politics. And it's more important now than perhaps ever in our lifetime. And can we have a couple ground rules to the conversation? We're not trying to persuade each other. We're trying to understand each other. Ground rule one. Ground rule two is let's try to listen more than we speak. Maybe a second one. And so I want to get to a stage, like let's say, Pat, your son, Mark, has a different view than you on something. So let's say you say, Mark, I want to know your position, why you support Trump or vice versa, why you support Biden better than you do. I want to be able to represent your position. So you got it, Dad, you got it. That's why I could never vote for Trump, or that's why I could never vote for Biden. And then turnabout's fair play. So, all right, like, okay, now I want to hear you why I'm going to vote the way I am. And can you listen to me and see that? And like a lot of things, it may not be black and white. It may be marvelously gray. And say that. I mean, I know so many people who are struggling with the person versus the party, the person versus the policies, and not even the person, but who might follow the person. This is a very unusual election, to say the least. And maybe you could also say to your kids, what a train wreck that was last night. I hope we never have a conversation like that. I hope we can learn from their poor example. And maybe we've been clumsy in the past, and maybe we've just avoided the topic like the plague because all we do is fight. But wow, let's see if we can be different than those two men last night. And let's see if we can have a conversation that even if we don't change our view one iota, that's not the goal. The goal is I just want to understand your view. And I love you that much that I just want to understand your view. Something that's maybe, Jack, I'd go somewhere in that direction.
I had a roommate at Princeton who was dating his high school sweetheart, and she visited us on lots of weekends. And I remember when his mother came to campus at one point and said to me, I don't really want to know what they're doing. They're here. I'm in Ohio. I just don't want to know. And I think that probably is a good description of a lot of parents' approach toward their children's relationships. But now you can't turn your head anymore because they're back in the house that they grew up in. How do we deal with those relationships, particularly when they feel wrong?
So in other words, they feel wrong, and to be blunt, like maybe their sexual boundaries or sexual activity, that sort of stuff, or
Oh
do you
no, or just that's life. They just feel like the wrong relationship, the wrong person. You can see all the problems that your kid can't see.
yeah. Well, Karen and I had that with one of our nieces, and at one point, and we didn't know what to do, so we asked three different couples whom we respected immensely, what would you do? And we got three different answers. One is they got to figure it out themselves. In fact, I know actually another couple, Mimi, you're in this call. We talked with Mimi and her husband Bob about this as well. One couple said they got to go their own way. Another couple said, no, you owe it to your child. You owe it to your child. It's almost parental mismalpractice if you don't tell them, I think you're about to go off a cliff. I may be wrong, but you owe it to them. Another person said, and this is kind of where we landed, what they said, and they had this with one of their daughters, no Princeton relationship, not that that matters. They said, look, we want to sit down and have a very serious conversation with you. We'd like to, whether you want to do it, like you set a time for it. We could do it now, or do you want to do it tomorrow? Like, when is a good time where we can have a serious conversation? And by the way, that may be something you want to do with this. Don't just spring it on them if they're getting ready to go out on an adventure or whatever. Pick a time so everyone's in the right frame of mind. And what they say to their daughter is the following: we love you immensely. We will always be there for you, no matter what wonderful thing you do or what terrible thing you do or anything in between. We are always there for you. No conditions. We love you unconditionally. Point one. Point two, because we love you so much, we think we owe it to you to tell you we think you're making a mistake, or you have the potential to make a mistake, or a lot of yellow warning signs go off, or whatever you want to call it, amber lights go off in our mind. And we feel obliged to tell you. We could be dead wrong. 20 years from now, we might be laughing about this conversation, but we need to tell you that. And we're going to tell you what those issues are, A, B, and C, whatever it might be. And the last thing is, this is the only time we're going to have this conversation. We're not going to nag you every week, and let's say it's in this case a daughter, and say, well, Tom is really a jerk, and I told you he was an addict, or I told you that he's not going to let you pursue your career, whatever it is. Don't be ready. Like say, I'm going to have this serious conversation once, and anytime you want to reopen, we will. We will try to love him in as much as we can and treat him as we treat you, but you need to know this. And that's the approach we finally took. We had one hard, painful conversation with lots of tears, lots of love, and that was our one conversation.
Do you think parents sometimes have trouble having that conversation with their kids because the kids have had front row seats to all of the problems that have taken place in their own marriage?
Yeah, I mean, let's face it. I don't know about the folks in this call, but if you take the nation's average, more or less half the marriages end in divorce. So kids will rightly be, and a lot of sociologists and research will say that a lot of kids are afraid to enter into permanent relationships, permanent defined as being married, where you go in with that view. They're cautious. They've seen their parents who they love and admired couldn't get it right. So how could they? I mean, even in my own life, my parents got divorced after 20 years and 7 years of marriage. Like, whoa, what happened? And so you could easily get gun shy and push off the decision. In fact, there's a sociologist of religion from Notre Dame who writes about something called a new phase of life. You used to go from sort of teenage years right into adulthood, early adulthood. And now he has a new category called delayed adulthood. And adulthood used to be defined by getting married, getting jobs and paying taxes, and sooner or later having kids. All that's been pushed back about 10 years, even if you get married. Now, couples may live together, but postpone the marriage thing. So there's a lot of anxiety. I think that's another thing to talk about. And frankly, even though I study and think a lot about theology and religion, I don't look at that question so much from a moralistic point of view, whether you're married or not. I mean, that's an interesting question, but it's more about, why are you postponing this? Is it because of mom and dad, because we got divorced, or have we been a bad role model for you? Open that box and let them help guide you. They might be they might have had some hidden guilt for all you know, or you might. I mean, we might. So yeah, that's a big topic to go into, and one worth doing, because many of them will have had some intimate relationships that failed, or maybe they're in the middle of an intimate one and they don't know. When do you pull the plug? I mean, all of us know who are married on this call that at least our marriage, it's wonderful and beautiful, but it's not linear. and how do you get through those tough times?
You know, I think tough times in marriages, most people go through them, even if the marriage survives. But there are also things that have happened in most of our lives that we're embarrassed about. And the question is how open we should be with our kids about those kinds of things. You know, the one-night stand, an abortion, unethical behavior that we turned a blind eye to.
Yeah.
David, I think you used an example in your class of, we won't name names, but a prominent businessman who you thought of as a really ethical guy who then got caught up in the whole
The Varsity Blues
Varsity Blues scandal. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, he was forced to talk to his kids about that, but some of these other things kids don't know about. You know,
Yeah.
do they need to?
That's public domain knowledge, and he wouldn't mind me saying his name is Doug Hodge. He used to be the CEO of PIMCO, extraordinarily successful and wealthy. We've known each other for 40 years, and Dartmouth grad, and he's now sitting in Otisville Federal Penitentiary. And he and I correspond via, there's an email system called CoreLink, Corrections Link, that the way you email with incarcerated. So yeah, and I would have in a million years never thought he would have done what he did with the scandal. But your question is a terrific one. How do you balance openness and naked candor without crossing a line that was just not appropriate, not necessary to say you had an affair, for example? Just because that would be obviously an extremely painful thing, I'm sure, for any parent to acknowledge to a child.
And, you know, arguably it's a learning experience and you learn from it, but I don't know that you necessarily need to give your kids the gory details for them to learn from it as well.
I'd agree, and because you might, and you know, the 12-step programs, AA and others, you know, they talk about trying to make amends at different levels of the steps to those you might have harmed, and of course you don't want to cause more harm by trying to help. So I think I would err on the side of discretion. I think most of us, by the time we get to the age of being parents of adult age children, we have a long list of things we could share where we wish we could have a mulligans, a do-over, and none are that painfully, emotionally painful. But I think where you could go is find examples that aren't going to cause harm or aren't going to have anyone cause intense sadness or pain. Like, did any of us in this phone call ever get fired from a job? Whether for performance or just laid off, just bad luck. Well, what was it like to be fired? Because what they're going through right now, and we haven't mentioned this yet, is that they feel the rules got changed in the middle of the game. They got this elite education, wherever they went, didn't have to be Princeton, and good education, they're out, they started their career, they played by the rules, and suddenly, whoa, the pandemic happened and everything's changed. The rules have changed. Work from home, furloughs, layoffs, everything. Can you think of a time when maybe the rules changed in your life, that suddenly things happened? Vietnam War would be one example. There could be others. Or an industry sector just went out, or your boss fired you for something. So I think there are many less volatile topics, but they could completely relate to when the world has changed and they weren't quite sure how could they ever get out of it. Could they ever get out of it? So I think, yeah, some prudence, but candor is maybe a nice balance.
Good. Well, that's actually my list of questions. Any final thoughts, David, that you'd like to share with us? And I'm looking at the chat, not too many questions here, but feel free if you've got one to type it in and we can get David to give us his thoughts before we sign off.
And if anyone chimes in, I'll stop talking, but I'll just throw out a couple of thoughts that I've learned and my students gave me that are in this you could ask the question, what do you, or they may ask the question, what do you wish you knew when you were my age? If you could, what would you say to your younger self? So you're not saying it to them like, oh, Abby, this is what I want you to be like. But no, when I was your age, Abby, I wish someone had told me X. That might be a question. I think the other is, I would open up the marriage box, not to get into sordid details, but you know, how do you think about marriage, and how do you navigate the highs and lows? Because that's on their minds. They know what's going to happen. They saw it happen with their parents. Another thing which some students actually mentioned to me is the dark side of social media. One student wrote a comment that she said that there was this odd thing of choosing inaction through distraction. And I'm quoting, inaction through distraction. C.S. Lewis actually preached a sermon back during World War II called Learning in Wartime. And he said that there are sort of three enemies, and he didn't mean Hitler or Japan, but three enemies that face us. They paralyze us. And one was sort of overexcited, like being distracted by the wrong things. The other was frustration and perfectionism, that we can't do things as perfectly as we like. And this third one is that we try not to feel pain and fear, so we numb ourselves. That sort of made me think, thought of that sermon when this student said, of this inaction through distraction. So that's playing a video game all night long, or that's just mindlessly surfing through social media and all the different things that could distract us. It's okay to feel pain. And maybe that's a message to tell your kids. If you could think back, and of course, if you know, some of the men on this call, we might all have been raised to be macho and not share our feelings, but you know, if we're really honest, did we ever have a time where maybe today we might say we were somewhat depressed even? And we hid in alcohol, or we hid in whatever.
You know, there's a question here from Adras Duaney, and you know, those of you who've been on these Princeton Club of South Florida calls know that one of my favorite topics is the founder of our club, Gaston Drake, class of 1894. And you read back, his family came to Florida just after the Civil War. And so reading about the Civil War and how colleges were just emptied because the young men were either drafted or left school in order to fight for both the Union or the Confederacy. And so I think Andre's question is a good one. You know, he's saying, you know, given those were upheaval events for young people. And how do you now deal when a student says, I'm reading his quote, "I'm really bummed. I need to quit college because my semester in Rome was canceled." And that is, you know, we're assuming here that every one of your child's concerns is a legitimate one that needs to be met with understanding and sympathy, but sometimes they could just be spoiled.
My short answer is yes. And actually, I'm really glad you asked that question, Andres, and made that point, because I think one of the things where having a few extra years under our belt, that chronologically as adults, older adults, that we have a better sense of perspective. We've lived more years, and it's not necessary that we're smarter. In fact, our children are probably smarter than we are, but we have perspective, and perspective usually only comes with time. So I think what we could bring to the conversation is a sense of perspective that, yeah, I think we need to honor that, yeah, the pandemic, your orbit, your life as you knew it is dramatically different. And oh my gosh, that's got to be really hard. And to honor that, and then to say, to have a sense of perspective, if it helps you, let's think back to some other things that I experienced in my life when I thought my world was falling apart. It's not that we have to brag that our trauma was harder, that Vietnam War was harder, or the Great Depression was harder. So I don't think we want to get into a contest, but just give perspective that other generations, ours included, have had curveballs hit which were devastating, whether nationwide or just in our own family orbit or regional orbit. And you know what, we got through them. And how did we get through them? We stuck together. We we developed another level of grit and determination we didn't know. If our faith or our spirituality is part of who we were, we tapped into that deeper, because that's a great source of encouragement and hope and power for people, because we need hope in difficult times. So I think letting them know that, all things will get better. And yeah, it's really hard right now, but not to be cynical, kind of like, welcome to adulthood. And someday you're going to be having this conversation with your child or your grandchild or your nephew or your niece when they bump into their equivalent of the pandemic or a global recession or fill in the blank. So perspective, I think, is a really precious gift, not in a comparative, my day was harder, but in a, I appreciate what you're saying, and this too will pass. But we can't get inactive through distraction. We need to really lift up and dig in.
Let's close with this question from Ezra Bookman. Whether there are any insights from religious traditions that you study, David, that you think are particularly relevant for having these difficult conversations with our kids?
Wow, yeah. Before I do that, I just happened to, I'm sort of sitting here and not able to see who all is looking, but I did just notice that Devin, one of my former students there. Hello, Devin. I hope you're doing well out in the greater Chicago area. Great to see your name pop up. Yeah, what are some of the religious traditions? And by the way, one of the questions I ask the students is, at these three different traditions we tend to focus on. Are they different? Are they the same? And what we focus on isn't their belief set, but more their practices, their teaching. So it's not so much their what's right belief, but what's right behavior, what's good behavior, what's healthy behavior in a society. And there's a surprisingly large, or not surprisingly large, Venn diagram overlap between the different traditions. So one is the specific quote that comes out of the Christian tradition, the New Testament, where Jesus says, the rabbi says, because of course Jesus is a rabbi, says, speak the truth in love. It's a really powerful statement. Speak the truth, but in love, not in sort of holier than thou or aggressive or putting someone down, but speak the truth. And I think that can give our adult children a huge amount of respect that you're speaking the truth as best you understand it, and to hold together that there are often multiple truths, and sometimes they kind of compete with each other, and the real gifted person can hold those together in a creative tension. So I think this teaching, religious teaching writ large of speaking the truth kindly is a good message for today, and a good message in these conversations. Another one might be, we just talked on, but religion has a different, understands time, the arc of time in a religious lens is very different than our human arc of time. Is it 4-year election cycles? Is it annual earnings per share? Is it quarterly returns? Or what did you do for me today? Religion tends to think in a longer term, both during our lives and even a sense of eternity or infinity. So that can, for many people, give hope that there's time and there's more out there. Most religions have just gone through the days of awe and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So there's this sense of how do I get myself whole with those who I've wronged? This time of reflection and healing. I just wrote a big paper with a colleague on restoration of trust. There's a big breakdown of trust in society, all aspects, and we looked at what do these three religious traditions have to do about restoration of trust. And I ended up presenting the paper at Davos. It was extraordinary. One of my clients commissioned me to write it. We wrote it, went to Davos, and the business people were asking the same thing. And extraordinary to think that, wow, ideas of how to have healing and wholeness. One thing is there's a breach of trust, but how do you restore it? How do you rebuild it? In religious traditions, all of them give some pathway back to healing. Take a common example people might think of in Catholicism. It has the rite of confession. Well, after you do this, not just lip service, if you take it seriously, it's a way to rebuild. There's different rituals, different customs, different techniques, and all of them talk about self-care and other care. So if you're having this conversation with an adult child, you want to be caring for them and yourself in this conversation. And with a bit of, if you'll pardon the pun, God's grace, it'll be very uplifting and moving to both you and your adult children.
Well, I think, David, on that note, we'll thank you for your insights. The one final note I think that you made about speak the truth with love, always a good reminder in this time where 200,000 people have already died of coronavirus, that these are our children, and the time that we have together is limited. So it's good to engage, and it's good to have these substantive conversations, but the most important one is to tell one another that we love one another. And thank you for joining us on this. We're struggling with doing virtual events for the club. So if anybody has any ideas of things that you'd like to hear or do, I may ask you to help run them, but please get in touch with me. And as we mentioned before, if you have any questions for David that you didn't have answered or that you didn't want to talk about publicly, he's at dwm@princeton.edu.
Hey, Pat, can I make one PS?
Yes.
Like a lot of things, if it's not your family norm to have conversations about deep questions with your parents or adult children, be kind to yourself. And if you muff the first one or two and you really screw it up, go easy on yourself. Take a deep breath. Tell your adult child the next day or whenever, like, hey, I really mishandled that. And can we start again? I really want to get this right. So don't expect perfection in your first time at bat. You're not going to hit a home run probably, and that's okay.
True enough. All right. Thank you all.
And Pat, thank you for your kindness and all the hard work you put into putting this together. Really appreciate it.
It was good. I think it was good. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.